start the session. This is an essential session before you can get lunch, so that I think we have enough of a quorum here. I'm Eric Hanushek, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University. We are going to come back to a topic that has come up throughout the morning, and that is education. It's been done in a sort of casual way of sort of saying, when we're talking about place, that sort of says, oh, and of course education is important. What we're going to do is talk entirely about education and where we stand now. I'm going to talk specifically about the current state of education coming out of pandemic times and into today. Nat Malkus is going to follow to talk a little bit more details about what we've done and what has happened over this time period. And Macke Raymond is going to follow with a discussion of where things might go and how we might get farther ahead. The story is not a very pretty one, and so I'm going to give that part, and maybe we can find a way to go away from there. The session is entitled Learning Losses and Economic Consequences, and I'm going to try to give just a quick overview of where we're at. If you go back, my sense of history is not very long. If we go back to March of 2020, all the schools in the US closed in March of 2020. And the immediate discussion for the remainder of the 2020 school year was essentially, what do we do now that we've closed the schools? What are we going to go back to? And there was, I think, a quite broad consensus that it was not just going back to where we were, but that we had to make the schools better. And so that's the setup, I think, for what we came out of the pandemic with. Let me talk a little bit about that. What I want to talk about is first the magnitude of learning losses that came about through school closures and the disjoint way in which we went back to schooling, and then give you some rough estimates, back of the envelope estimates of the economic costs of the pandemic and where we're at. Here's the simple picture. What we have the National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP, that has tested a representative sample of the US population going back actually to 1970. Here's the most recent period in which I've normalized everything to starting at where we were at the beginning of the 21st century, where we were at in 2002, actually. And these are math scores of 8th graders. We're going to talk in general about the entire population. This is not race-based for reasons that we'll talk about later. But you saw that during the 2000s, the early 2000s, test scores were increasing. The vertical scale is basically standard deviations of test scores away from where we were in 2002. Scores were increasing, and then there's sort of a little bit of a blip there. But what we saw, and what has captivated everybody, is the drop in scores during the pandemic. These are the picture that I've got there is the drop in scores from 2019 to 2022. This is kind of a crude estimate of learning losses, sort of saying if the cohort of 8th graders in 2022 was roughly equal to the cohort in 2019, the difference in scores tells you how much they lost over what they would have been without a pandemic. And so that's what we typically call learning loss. After 2022, I guess we can call that post-pandemic. I'm not sure when we date things. But then there's this little continued fall. This is not consistent across all tests. After 2022, some different tests show a slight increase, some show flat scores. The 8th grade math score shows a slight decline. But the point is that in 2024, we are noticeably below where we were in 2002. And so we have fallen below, erased any gains we made in the early 2000s and have fallen down. Now, there's a second part of this that I think Nat is going to talk about in more detail also, is that the losses were not uniform. And in particular, I'll give you one version of it, and I think Nat has a different version. If you look at the details of the NAEP testing, they rank people by different categories of scores. So there are achieving basic skills, achieving proficient levels of performance, achieving advanced levels of performance, and the remaining category is below basic. And below basic, I think, roughly means that you're not ready to participate in a modern economy. These are low-level skills that we have. And if I go to that chart, here's the picture of what proportion of the 8th graders in the US were below basic in their skills over time. So you see that it starts out at about 30, a little over 30, 32% of the population was recorded as below basic. That falls, consistent with the average scores and everybody increasing, falls until 2012 when we measure that. And then we see this increase that has the same pandemic increase and the same post-pandemic increase to where we're at for the entire population is roughly 40% of the US population. This is basically can't do a simple algebra problem in 8th grade or something that looks close to an algebra problem. So what does that mean for the economic cost? The US rewards these skills more than almost every other country in the world. The rewards to knowing more math are higher in the US than everybody except maybe Singapore. And if you just take historic estimates of the value of these skills and multiply them times the kind of earnings losses you get there, it comes out with a story that says at the individual level, the average student who is in school during the pandemic will lose 6% of their lifetime earnings. 6%. And no one would think of a 6% increase in income tax rates, right? But that's essentially what we have. If you were a low-income student or a low achiever in particular that Nat will talk about, the average loss is 9% of lifetime earnings, okay? And so that's where we have this discussion of we have to make the schools better because we have to sort of make up for this loss that was substantial over this time period. There's another aspect that I'll highlight also, given that we're in Washington, D.C., and the only thing that's talked about here are fiscal matters. It turns out that countries that have a better educated population grow faster, in simple terms. Countries depend upon the quality of their labor force. What the pandemic says is that the quality of our labor force was reduced as measured by these scores, which are not a bad measure of the quality of the future labor force. And if you work it through the historic estimates impacts on growth, bring it back in present value terms to today, you get numbers that are quite astounding. So the number that I would give you for the present value of lost future GDP from the pandemic in 2020 is $30 trillion. $30 trillion, which in 2020 terms is almost 1.5 times the current GDP of the country. It's like closing down the economy for a year. Okay. Now, the thing that is a little bit puzzling is how everybody is so complacent about these losses. If you put that in terms of the things that really matter in the economy, like the 2008 recession, the Great Recession, the cost of the pandemic in future terms is 6 times the total cost of the 2008 recession. And it comes out to be 17 times the cost of the pandemic on the rest of the economy, the things that everybody pays attention to. So as another way of motivating this before I turned over to my compatriots, here's the picture I showed you at the beginning of the grade 8 NAEP scores and the fall in the pandemic. What has never been emphasized in this discussion is the following. There was a big fall from 2012 to the recession, to the pandemic. And that the pandemic was in some sense a continuation of a trend that started beforehand. So I just leave you with one final estimate. 21 million lost is the number of students who were in K-12 education during the pandemic who have now left the K-12 system. And if you think about it, higher education and employers are unlikely to make up for the lost learning that these students have had. So that there's 21 million who have been permanently scarred in some sense by the pandemic. And we're counting, because as I showed you at the bottom, after our most recent data have a further decline from the bad situation in terms of the pandemic. So that's the joyful terms that I use to set up my panelist. Nat Malkus is senior fellow here at AEI, and he's going to talk a little bit about what's been going on in the economy. And Macke Raymond is distinguished research fellow at the Hoover Institution, who will follow on.
Thanks, Rick, and thank you all. Let me get through these placeholder slides. There it is. Okay, I'm going to sort of follow up a little bit on what Rick was talking about. I'll just, as by way of background, March 2020 happened. I was kind of wondering what is going on in U.S. schools. I'm a guy who kind of usually looks at other people's data, wasn't there, so I started gathering data. I gathered data on school closures and masking, on enrollment shifts, and chronic absenteeism, which takes up a large part of my market share right now. I want to show you some of the shapes of what have happened over a longer period than just the pandemic, and zoom out, retreading a little bit of what Rick has gone over, but digging down on it. Okay, so this is also NAEP scores, and it's also 8th grade. This is reading, and I'm going to show you way more test scores than Rick did, but I want you to pay attention to the shape of them, not as much any particular data point. But these are also centered on 2013 to 2015, which on many of these test scores we're going to look at was sort of the zenith. This was the highest point. So this is how much they have risen is on the left side and how much they fell. And the pandemic is right here. Can you see that on the screen? It's just barely shaded right there. And so you can see a steep fall in reading. It wasn't quite as bad as math on this. And so we see two things that Rick talked about. One is, wow, the pandemic declines were rapid. The slope was much steeper than before, but we're going back here from 1990, and this sort of tail, the pre-pandemic rise was strong and long, even if it isn't as strong as we would have liked. We might wanted to see more increases, but the fall has predated the pandemic by a good bit. So this is reading, and then these are 4 other scores. Again, you can see that they all cross over each other at that 2013 point, which was roughly the high point on 4th and 8th grade reading and math. That's the 4 points. But I want to get underneath these averages a little bit. So we're back at reading, and the reason that I want to get underneath the averages is because lower performing students got hit harder. So this, it seems difficult, but these are scores on the same test, and the green line are the kids in the 90th percentile. So these are the highest scoring kids relative to where they scored in 2013. So we're just looking at changes. And what you'll notice is that their increase in the pre-pandemic period was a little bit less than the kids in blue. That's the 10th percentile. So the blue are our lowest performers. And so they, since the early 90s, had larger gains up to 2013. And then after the pandemic, what you notice is that green line really doesn't go down that far. That means our higher performing students, post-2013 and during the pandemic, didn't lose that much ground. The only way the average goes down is if the low performers lost a boatload of ground. And these are also in that negative 50 is percentages of a standard deviation. And I don't know how to quantify what half a standard deviation is for non-social scientists, but huge is I mean, it's breathtaking is what it is. And that's for 10% of the population. And you can also see the gap between the 90th and the 10%. So that's the gap at that far end in the 2024 scores, which continued to open up. So if you remember what Rick showed you earlier, well, there was a little bit decline after the pandemic ended from 2022 to 2024, but that slight decline, at least in reading, was really no decline for our high performers and a rapid decline for our low performers. So I told you to pay attention to the shape. This next graph is not visually pleasing, but it proves a point. So I included, it gets worse, These are all 4 NAEP tests. So we have 8 lines, math, reading, grade 4 and grade 8. But if you look to the left, you kind of see this spaghetti. It's hard to tell. You can see everybody's kind of going up, but the red and green lines sort of cross over. And then look to the right. What happens to the red and green, not red and green, the green and blue lines? All the blue lines drop, and all the green lines are much closer to flat. We can do a lot more tests. And so this is PISA, this is TIMSS, this is a boatload of tests on students in many subjects, and actually I restricted this somewhat. Again, you can see this crazy sort of spaghetti pattern to the left that is visually dissonant, and then you see a pretty clear pattern emerging on the right. To contain all these scores, I had to open up the scale of the graph. So note that it's no longer at negative 60, it's negative 80% of a standard deviation since 2013-15, and we have some scores that are dropping like that. So what I'm trying to point to is that what we've seen during the pandemic, but actually from before that, continuing through the pandemic and increasing after the pandemic, is a huge gulf between our top performers, who are basically treading water, and our lower performers, who are dropping like a rock. I don't have other distributions on this. The one other thing that I will say in work that is sort of ongoing, but I'm not ready to kind of put out there yet, is we typically talk about these achievement gaps. Historically, we think of an achievement gap and we think, well, there's a race-based achievement gap. There's the black-white gap, the Hispanic-white gap, or there's an income gap, right? Poor versus richer students and what those gaps are. The gap between the top and bottom is growing more rapidly now than the income gap or the race-based gap since this 2013 period, and that was not true before, which means that income gaps and race-based gaps are not as much the drivers that they once were. That's sort of preliminary work, and I'm happy for Macke and Rick to tell me that I'm not there yet. But look, one of the things that I think Rick pointed to about the costs is that we don't seem to have the kind of concern that we should have about what we're seeing just in average test scores, and I would argue particularly for our low performers. It seems like there's something going on with our lower performers that is not happening with our kids at the upper end of the distribution. And I do think that we are sort of underplaying how big of a problem this is, both for our economic future in our society, but also for the students on the lower end of the spectrum. There's the competitive disadvantage that they face in the future is growing. Some of this can be calculated on the cost side, but I mentioned earlier that I do a lot of work now on chronic absenteeism. So chronic absenteeism is the percentage of students in school that are missing 10% of the school year. And I'm going to skip that one for right now. This is the national chronic absenteeism numbers. I keep gathering these because it takes too long for the federal government to put them together. And so we can see pre-pandemic in like 2018 and 2019 that we had a pretty stable basis of the percentage of kids who were missing a tenth of the school year. These kids have lower academic outcomes. It's one of the strongest predictors of whether you're going to graduate high school, or more accurately, whether you're not going to graduate high school. And it was fairly stable. No, then the pandemic hit in 2020, cutting off the attendance data for the last half of the year, so that's not really something we could count on. The next year, half the nation was closed for half the year or remote, so that data is not great. And in 2022, the first quasi-post-pandemic year, the 15% rate went to 28%. So that's more than 1 in 4 kids missed 10% of the school year. And that rate has been falling, but slowly in the past few years, so that we're down to about 23.5%, still well over 1 in 5 kids are still missing a tenth of the school year. I would say that this is sort of different than, well, why aren't you paying attention to the economic fallout, or why aren't you paying attention to the test scores? This is measuring people's sort of response. This is just human behavior. Students are not going to school at the rates that they were before. Many more are much more absent, and that's an indicator of just how much attendance we have, which is also below historic levels. So no matter how you slice it, you can look at how the test scores have depreciated over time, particularly for disadvantaged students. Disadvantaged students are also much more likely to be chronically absent, and at least how behaviors are changing post-pandemic, we seem not to care enough about it. Macke, I've spread enough sunshine, so I will turn it over to you.
I don't have any of that, yes, thank you. So I usually only have one depressing story that I have to try to counteract, and now I have 2. So one, I want to thank Ian and AEI for having me here today. Delighted to be with you again for the second time at the Old Parkland Conference. These numbers tell a really desperate story about what's happening to kids. And I want to sort of pile on to that by talking a little bit about what we've tried over the last several decades to improve outcomes for kids and what we've learned from that effort. And I think what we've learned from that effort actually does set us up for a more optimistic conversation, and that's what I'd like to end with. So I am your ray of sunshine, for what it's worth. Many of you know that in 1983, there was a report published called A Nation at Risk. And this was a comprehensive stock taking of what was happening in the US public education system. And the news wasn't great then. The seminal sentence from that was, if a foreign nation had done to us what we have done to our children, we would have considered it an act of war. And that report concluded with a checklist of marginal changes that were recommended as an attempt to improve results for kids. Needless to say, you see from these data that that did not happen on a large scale. Well, 40 years later, a number of organizations around the country did a reprise of that report, and the Hoover Institution was one of them. Unlike the other reports, which were essentially just a new checklist of things we ought to try to do, what the Hoover team decided to do was to look back over the 40 years and ask the question, what have we tried? And what do we learn from about what we tried? And in order to do that, we gathered a dozen experts in various parts of the K-12 system, whether it was school choice, whether it was early childhood, whether it was curriculum, whether it was whole school models, and so on. Asked them to take a deep dive in their silo of work. And the results of that came to me to synthesize. And so you have to imagine I have 12 different sets of things we've tried and here's what we've learned, pasted all over my office. And the news was pretty darn shocking that of the billions and billions of dollars that we have spent trying to improve education, the vast majority of that got us exactly zippo. Even where we could find programs that were successful in their initial rollout, the vast majority of those did not scale successfully. And looking across all of this, there were a couple of bright spots. I'm going to put a pin in one of them and ask you to be patient as I finish the analysis of what this Nation at Risk Plus 40 report came up with. What we learned from that was that most of the attempts that we've made are marginal small changes to an existing production function, as economists would call it. Our basic recipe stays the same, and we decide to change one input. And somehow that input, whether it's a new set of curricula, whether it's a new pedagogy for teaching social studies, whatever, we send in a single marginal input, supposedly like we're shooting into the Death Star, it's going to magically catalyze the whole system, right? You might imagine that's not going to work very well. So marginal changes turned out not to be a good investment. The second thing we learned was that the system actually gets better over time at resisting change. And so the way in which you see these incredible shifts in the achievement of students, what you're looking at in many ways is the growing learning of the institutions of education becoming more oriented to their own homeostasis and survival than change. This is a dramatic finding. And so now I want to take that pin and bring it back. The one place that we see really significant sustained change is in the charter school experience. Now, I have to do a little disclaimer here because my team at Stanford, CREDO, the Center for Research on Education Outcomes, is known for producing these large national studies on how charter schools are educating their kids compared to what those kids would have gotten had they gone to their own little local district schools. Okay, so big grain of salt. Part of our work is what I'm going to talk about here. We did 3 national studies, one in 2009, where charter school students weren't learning as much in either reading or math as their district twins. 2013, where they were pulling even with their district peers. And 2023, where in fact there are statistically significant and positive experiences for charter school students in both subjects. Now, the charter school movement, they take that third study and they go, woo-hoo, we win. They miss the entire picture, which is the trend line. Across these 3 studies, the number of days of learning that changes from our first study to our third study is 26 extra days of learning. That's like going to school for an extra 6 weeks. And that sits in both reading and math. It's the only thing in my entire office of here's what we've tried that shows a positive and sustained trend. And so we dig into that and we say, what could possibly account for that? 2 things. One, our study revealed that it's not that charter schools authorizers shut down bad schools. That fraction of schools is shrinking, but it's not because bad schools are being closed. It's because if you look at the data over the thousands of schools that are in our study, the schools themselves are getting a little bit better over time. Not huge Hail Mary jumps in performance, not the 0.2 effect size that everybody holds out as the holy grail of school improvement. Little, tiny increments of change, but consistent. And we see this in urban schools, we see this in suburban schools, we see this in rural schools. The second thing is we identified thousands of charter schools that never allow an achievement gap to occur in student learning. So Black students learn the same amount in a year's time as white students in those schools. Hispanic kids, the same amount as white students. Poverty kids, the same amount as non-poverty kids. And so we call those schools gap busters. And what we find in the great results that we're seeing is that counter to the Black narrative in district schools, which is declining over time, what you've got is you've got not only overall improvement, but you've got specific targeted on-track performance for minority and poverty students. Not only are there thousands of charter schools that do this, but there are dozens and dozens of charter management organizations. These are collections, networks of charter schools under a single management structure. There are dozens of charter management organizations that have managed to do this at scale. And somebody mentioned KIPP earlier. There are dozens of charter management organizations that are doing this with as many as 200 schools in their network. These are phenomenal insights. If you want to think about how to improve outcomes for kids, it's not the Hail Mary, it's small improvements, and it's making sure that learning in a year's time does not reveal what we call learning gaps, which are the building blocks of achievement gaps over time. So those are the 2 things we managed to figure out from all of the work that we did on what have we tried to improve outcomes for kids. What does that mean for us moving forward? Well, clearly, we need kids in school. If we have large degrees of absenteeism, that's not helpful. Well, absenteeism in the kinds of schools that I'm describing here is much lower. And part of that is because the students themselves, as they are surveyed in their school climate surveys, believe that they have the ability to learn. And this is dramatically different than the attitudes that are revealed in climate surveys in district schools. So we have a culture piece. We've been discussing culture in a larger sense, but now we can go micro into individual kids and how to bring them the kind of, somebody asked for confidence, somebody asked for efficacy. We have an idea that giving them the confidence and proof that they do learn is a deductive function of actually moving them forward. So, armed with this huge amount of information, the director of the Hoover Institution, Condoleezza Rice, called for a task force, the Education Futures Council, to be made up of successful education entrepreneurs from across the country, looking at what could we do to actually change the outcomes for millions of kids. And their conclusions, almost instantly, it's the system, it's the institutional structures, and it's the system itself that is the impediment to change. And so we have to think about things differently. And I won't go into all of the details, but the report is available on the Hoover website. If you just type in Hoover Education, it will come up. But I'll give you a couple of salient pieces to this. The idea that we can mandate from remote locations programs and requirements that fit all conditions on the ground has got to go. We have so much variation in our school districts across communities that one size fits all on a mandate basis cannot be the solution. So we're looking in a different way about using incentives, giving local capacity, local conditions much more of an influence in how they address student learning. The second thing is we have to make innovation and micro-innovation, which is what happens in classrooms in real time to address the learning needs of kids, business as usual across all schools. If you really think about what happens in a learning environment, it's teachers assessing whether or not students are getting it. And if they're not getting it, how do they respond? And if we currently have both the technology and the success information to be able to provide teachers and school teams lots more information about how to address learning barriers than we ever have before, and we don't make it available to them. So thinking about enriching their opportunity environment and making it business as usual that they will modify on a regular basis to address the needs of their kids. I'm not saying throw out the entire learning plan, but really address the barriers of individual kids. We can do that. We were never in a position to do that before, but we can do it now. Bringing innovation and the expectation that you are constantly bringing better to your students is the way that you get that small increment of change. Not huge changes, maybe 1%, 2% at a time. We know that that can happen. We know that it's possible to support educators to do that. And so bringing innovation as business as usual instead of this exceptional way that we do it now. If you want a great idea, you go get a waiver from your state. Everything stays the same, but you've got a waiver over here. That's not going to change anything. And the system's going to kill that off, as it has killed off everything else. So let's break that and say, no, no, no. Innovation is the business that we're in. We're in the learning innovation business, and micro-innovation is the way that we get kids to move forward. So very briefly, we're thinking about if you want that, the rest of the system flexes in very specific ways in order to enable that. And who would have thought that in May of 2025, we would have a federal government offering on a platter the opportunity for that kind of change to happen? Because they're pushing all of the responsibility down to the states, who are going to have to change dramatically anyway. So why wouldn't you want them to change in this way, to get on a track where kids actually have a much better chance of improving their learning over time? So with that, I'm going to stop and bring it to a conversation.
Basically, school-based interventions. I mean, where does the family fit into this at all? You're looking mainly at somehow improving the classroom and making the blackboards cleaner or something. Are you really talking about how parental engagement with the parent? Is this among your reforms? Just asking.
So there's never a scenario where parents are not an extremely important partner in education.
Right. I just wondered which sort of reforms matter, given kind of focus on this conference.
I'm going to jump off of the Education Futures Council for a moment and talk about some work that my own team is doing. We've been talking to families, particularly in underserved communities around the country for the last 2 years, and finding out whether parents actually feel that they are getting right information about what their kids are doing and how well they're doing, and whether they are actively engaged as partners. And I cannot tell you the degree of frustration and hostility that we hear in many, many communities where they are not considered a resource, they are considered an irritant. The greatest schools, whether they're district schools or charter schools, and I guess I would even say private schools, although I can't say that empirically, but I can say it for the other two, the best schools treat parents as an essential partner and work to reinforce their capacities as well.
I'll just add that when it comes to and I'm mainly talking about public schools and the way we use our testing information, we just lie to parents. We lie to parents about how well their kids are doing. When we see the trends in grade inflation, that means the work that used to be C work is now B work, and so forth. That's lying to parents. And so if parents get signals like, well, they're actually doing okay, and they're not doing okay, then a relative lack of engagement might be in part the product of not engaging them in the honest discussion about how their students are doing. Look, we saw the test score results. There's a bunch of kids who are doing much worse than they were doing not a decade ago, 5 years ago, like a demonstrable amount. And we call these honesty gaps. We have lots of names for them, but the best way to name it is many schools lie to parents.
I want to reinforce that with some additional data from certain national survey polling data that we do. The number one source for information about how children are doing or how schools are doing isn't the one pager that families get at the beginning of the following school year about how their student did the year before, way late, not able to help. It's the district schools themselves control the vast majority of information that is available to how students are doing. Business folks, community-based organization leaders, families, electeds all rely on that district information. That's the number one source that they say they use. And the districts do not tell the truth. We did a sample of the top 50 school districts, and the distortion on the truth was phenomenal, and the attack on the credibility of the source of information was pervasive. Don't trust these numbers. They don't tell our story. Listen to us. Your kids are fine.
Let me take control as the moderator. You see, I have no control here. We were going to have a discussion, but we're going to open it for the audience. I wanted to bring up just two quick things that were not emphasized in the discussion so far, that originally Dan Goldhaber was going to come and talk about some of the things. The thing that he was probably going to talk about most was some intensive studies of a few districts that he's been doing, which found that the approaches of these school districts are often to try to add more time in some way or another, more tutoring or lengthening the school years. This has had quite varied success, and everybody always points to the 1 out of 8 school districts that seem to be successful at this method, but it's not very widespread. And so when you hear in the newspaper, oh, we're going to go for more intensive tutoring, Harry Holzer actually brought that up. It's done well in a small number of districts and usually doesn't stick. The other thing that Dan would have talked about is the fact that during the pandemic, the federal government provided $180 billion of extra funding to school districts. It went almost directly to school districts, not passing through any other filters. And there is a little bit of evidence that a couple research teams, including Dan's, have provided to suggest that maybe these funding had a small impact, but the estimate of the magnitude of any impact of these fundings was really very tiny. The second thing that wasn't brought up, and it comes from the pictures I showed that Nat re-emphasized, is that one of the big changes in 2015 was that we stopped having federal accountability for schools, basically, and we changed the accountability system from the dreaded No Child Left Behind to the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA. And Every Child Succeed Act basically said, states, we'd like you to have accountability systems, but it's up to you to figure it all out. And I think that one of the recent movements that comes back to what Macke was saying also is that there's been a concerted effort to eliminate assessments in the schools in various ways, particularly standardized assessments that you can use to deal with the lying of schools, the opportunity gap. This has been actually a coalition, I don't know if we're allowed to say this here, a coalition of the far left and the teachers union with the far right, the most conservative people who basically have joined together to say, well, testing shouldn't be a part of our policies toward education. So that's an overhang of this all. We're going to just open it up to questions. We're in pretty much agreement, so we're not going to have any strong disagreement here.
Am I hearing correctly the 26, sorry, am I understanding correctly the 26 extra days, I guess, in charter schools and the many, many incremental improvements are separate variables, or do they somehow accumulate?
No, so the difference over the 3 studies amounts to a 15-year time horizon. And the 26 days is the cumulative impact of these small changes along the way. Does that clarify?
Whoever has the microphone has control of this whole meeting, so.
Well, why don't we do side to side? Do you have any hands over here? Go get her.
Thank you for this excellent conversation. I was wondering, the teachers' unions were just brought up a moment ago. If we could speak a bit more about their role and the consequences of the teachers' unions. I'm just thinking with respect to the importance of innovation, micro-innovation, and a lot of discussion about the charter schools, and just by virtue of the fact that, for example, several urban centers such as Chicago have been a focus of this conference thus far. And it seems as though, particularly in Chicago, the teachers' union is intent on stifling a lot of innovation when it comes to charters, but also another model that hasn't really been touched upon, which is the selective enrollment or exam schools. So I was wondering if those schools could be discussed, and also more broadly, what innovation looks like when you have an organization such as the union that is not so interested in innovating. Thank you.
Teachers' unions have been awful, is the general story. I mean, you have Chicago, you have LA, you have New York City, you have Oakland is my favorite example, that it is still, while the kids were a year behind in their learning from the pandemic, there was an 8-day strike about having better plantings around the school, and that the school should house the homeless. And they'd already agreed on wages and benefits. It was just that they wanted to fix society, and through an 8-day strike to the kids who had been harmed by the pandemic. So, I mean, now that's not the only explanation. If you do it, I just recently did this on the airplane coming here. If you look at various measures of union strength across the states, it's basically uncorrelated with the amount of learning losses suffered by each of the states. So there's a lot of detail under the surface that is extraordinarily important. You can't just say the teachers' union have caused all this. They're important, but they haven't caused it all.
But which teachers union? I mean, there are a bunch of them.
I think both the AFT and the NEA.
Well, I want to jump in on this too, though, because I don't think that it's a fair statement to say that all unions are completely anti-change. I think the ones that we've been talking about today are extremely well organized against any kind of change, and they will kill off anything that threatens their members not having to do anything different. But there are actually first off, there are constructive unions around the country that actually work collaboratively with management, and I don't want to fail to acknowledge that it is possible to have collective bargaining and a constructive relationship around student learning. So I think that's possible. The second thing I would say is that there are a number of new unions that are growing up, and they have a very different posture around the denomination of their value. They denominate their value in terms of student learning and still want many of the same things that the traditional unions want, but they're willing to accept that the job that they're in is about cultivating knowledge and skills. So I think on both of those fronts, there are some really high-profile examples of unions that are incredibly destructive for kids. But I don't think that that's the majority of the story.
And I'm on the left, so I'm going to pull this one a little bit further left. I would say that while unions are problematic, I think CTU is the nuttiest union in Chicago, is the nuttiest union in the nation, and just crazily powerful. But nonetheless, don't mistake the boogeyman from the problem. There are a lot of management, and it doesn't really matter about their unions because they're not working to make schools coherent, results-driven organizations. And so it is a problem if we say, well, you know, the unions are bad, and if you assent to that and stop. That's a very problematic method of addressing what's going on in schools. You know, a lot of times we need extraordinary measures to make extraordinary steps. So Mike Miles down in Texas has had a couple of instances where he's been able to make extraordinary measures, and we need that on both the management side and on the union. And I think the union is most often a bit player when you think about who's responsible for the lack of change.
30-second footnote to that. North Carolina, a few years ago, the legislature passed a law that said that each school had to select its worst 5% of teachers or something like that and buy them out, pay them off. The union in North Carolina launched a suit against the legislature in this law. Two district superintendents joined the union and the plaintiffs, and the superintendents basically made the argument that, well, you know, it's really tough to make these decisions about teachers, and we shouldn't be forced to have to do that. So it is a more pervasive problem.
Why did test scores start dropping in 2013?
Ooh, I got this one.
Well,
It was the announcement that the ESSA legislation was going to start being marked up. And the signal came out that they were going to be moving on accountability because there had been, if you will remember No Child Left Behind, 2013 was the doomsday year where everybody was supposed to be proficient. And as we moved towards 2013, it was very clear that we weren't going to make that goal. And so the consequence of ESSA started as we're going to have a national shame show here. What are we going to do? And so the signal was the accountability piece was driving the revision of the No Child Left Behind Act, and that it was going to get softer. Everybody took their feet off the pedal. There weren't smartphones then.
I'll just throw in a couple of things. So I want to just get back to the slide I didn't get to. You see all these patterns, and I've actually been struggling with what is it? What happened in this? And it's sort of 2012 to 2015, depends on the test. And I do think that Mackie's right, that pulling our foot off the gas made a difference. But these scores that you see right here, they're not great tests, but those are adults age 16 to 65 in the United States. And that's their reading and math scores. And they are also dropping like a rock. So it's not only school problems, because we're also seeing it in adults. Let me repeat, these are not great test scores. They're not as high quality as I would like, but man, do they rhyme with the student test scores. So I do think that there is more than one thing here, and I do think that the rise of smartphones, which, you know, Jonathan Haidt's sort of timeline sort of kinks right there in the 2012-13 is part of it. But the other thing to not let schools off the hook is, let's just say, actually the most powerful factor is smartphones. Does that then mean that schools can be like, well, that's, what are we going to do? It's smartphones. Let's leave it to the AI. I really think that that's a losing proposition. So I think it's all the more concerned because that's our best method to shore up young people who I think are a little bit more, can we say, we can influence them better. I think that's our duty to do that through the schools.
Hi, I got to stand up for this one. I'm from Chicago, so and criticism of the Chicago Teachers Union is well deserved. They're the poster child for what we shouldn't be doing. There was two things I wanted to point out. One was, and I know you probably didn't mean to do this, is measuring the standard by what white students do. I don't want us to do that. I want us to know what the standard is, because in Chicago schools, there was a list out, I forgot who put it out, but they were showing that 0% of students are meeting the standard. 0. That includes white, Hispanic, and black kids. So, I'm sorry?
There were 80 schools in Chicago.
Yes. 0.
0.
And so if white kids are doing terrible, that can't be the standard for black kids. I want the standard to be the standard, right? And for us to be able to meet that standard. And there used to be a time when black kids were doing better than white students. It was many years ago, but they brag about Dunbar High School, things like that. So, and then there's another issue in the black community. It's how do we raise the standard if you got a cultural problem that says, speaking good English is acting white, or doing well in school is acting white, which is another reason why I don't want us to be talking about, white kids are here and black kids are here, and we want to get to the same place where white students are. No, I want to get to whatever the standard is, right? And that everybody needs to be reaching that standard, whether black, white, Hispanic, because it's not a white standard. Do you understand what I'm saying? I'm not trying to play the race card. I'm just trying to say the standard has to be the standard so that then people don't come up and say, oh, that's white supremacy. We got to raise up, we got to, measure up to the white students. No, we got to measure up to whatever the standard is. And it used to be the standard in the black community.
So I think that's important. We basically did not mention race and black, white in this whole panel. And in part, it was that these test scores coming out of the pandemic didn't really widen the black-white test score gap. And there's mixed evidence about whether they had an impact or not. From the overall story of what's the standard, that's how I come into this. If you look at the US on an international comparison, our 15-year-olds are 31st in the world in mathematics performance. And this 31st in the world is not going to sustain us, at least, particularly if we stop having H-1B visas, which we've relied on for some time. And so I think that there's a waving of a flag in the back of the room that says that our time is up. And as a result of that, I'm supposed to read a statement to you about, that basically says the people that were handing out the microphones are also in charge of when you go out to the buffet. And so somebody will come, not with a microphone, but give you the signal that you're allowed to go to the buffet. And at 12:50, Rob Henderson and Ian Rowe will have part of a continuation of our program, but hopefully the last table is to the buffet before that time. So thank you.